This is the face of a 73-year-old conflict where episode after episodes of extreme violence and layers upon layers of sustained hate, killings, destruction of homes and valued properties. Many of the warring fighters of each country have died, with the root of the conflict outlasting their final breath. Now, it's among the longest, the most divisive conflict in history that the least agitation would likely spark another episode of war. This is the Israel and Palestine conflict. A 73-year-old wound. What is the hope for healing? On May 6, 2021, the tension intensified across the Palestinian territories due to an Israeli court verdict to eject Palestinian families from their homes in 𝗪𝗪𝗪, east of Jerusalem, to favor a group of Israeli settlers. The verdict led to further protest. 𝗪𝗪𝗪 is a part of the Palestinian territory but lies under a belligerent occupation of Israel. Thus, Israeli laws prevails.
Jacob, you know this is not your house.
Yes, but if I go, you don't go back. So what's the problem? Why are you yelling at me? I didn't do this. I didn't do this.
But
It's easy to yell at me, but I didn't do this.
You are stealing my house.
And if I don't steal it, someone else is gonna steal it.
No one is allowed to steal it, يا عمي.
זה לא שלי להחזיר.
On May 7, 2021, in one protest, some Palestinians threw stones at the Israeli forces and Jewish protesters at Al-Aqsa compound. In response, they pursued the stone throwers, and during the pursuit, the Israeli forces raided the compound of the Al-Aqsa mosque and began using tear gas, rubber bullets, and stun grenades. On May 10, 2021, the Islamic resistance movement Hamas gave Israel an ultimatum to withdraw its forces from the Temple Mount complex and 𝗪𝗪𝗪 by 6 o'clock in the evening. Otherwise, Israel will experience attacks. As early as April, Hamas have been launching rocket attacks from Gaza Strip on Israeli territories, some of which were successfully intercepted by Israel's Iron Dome defense system, but some of them didn't. On that same day, the conflict ignited. Israel began its airstrikes against Gaza, causing damages to various infrastructures like towers, schools, and hospitals, including Al-Shati refugee camp. In response, Palestine fired rockets numbering in hundreds, creating havoc and terror across both countries' territories. After 11 days of fighting, both countries declared victory. But did they? While both countries apparently refused to be on the losing end, the only true losers in this war may be seen through the eyes of the victims and the unsettling sight of the war-torn states. In evaluating the damage caused of the war, Gaza's housing ministry reported that 16,800 housing units had been damaged, 1,800 houses become unfit for living, and 1,000 were totally shattered. From 12-hour supply, electricity has been reduced to 3 to 4 hours after the war. An estimated $40 million in damage to factories, $22 million damage to the energy sector as a result of the fight. On top of all that, the disturbing numbers of shattered family, at least 248 Palestinians were killed by Israeli when it bombarded Gaza, including 66 children. Palestine rocket fire took 13 Israeli lives, including 1 child. As in the war itself, the aftermath is even more disheartening. Families in Gaza were reported to be at the breaking point. Gaza children are said to be living in hell on earth. All these sufferings, the senseless violence, damage on buildings that will take more years to rebuild, and the human cost of war that can never be restituted. And still, the end of this war remains uncertain.
Just hours after a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas came into force this morning, there were clashes between Israeli police and Palestinians.
This negotiated ceasefire is only a mirage until the next episode of possible conflict restarts. Though history shows that the claim of both Jews and Arab Muslims emanates for about 1,000 years way back, the ongoing conflict was actually inflamed in the early part of the 20th century. In 1947, the United Nations approved the plan to partition Palestine into a Jewish and Arab state, but the Arabs strongly opposed it. In May 1948, Jewish leaders officially declared Israel as an independent state. It marked the beginning of Israel's more aggressive relation with the Arabs. Following this declaration, the Arab League to intervene, they marched their troops and started the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. Since this 1948 Arab-Israeli War, the fight between these clashing countries never stopped. The Suez Crisis in 1956, the Six-Day War in 1967, Yom Kippur War in 1973, Lebanon War in 1982, the first Palestinian Intifada in 1987, where protests and series of violent riots took over the West Bank and Gaza Strip by Palestinians against the Israeli occupation. Since then, war after wars after wars. Fast forward to this moment where Palestine and Israel clashes anew, and with all this seemingly endless cycle of violence coming from both ends, we are now seeing the wider impact it is creating worldwide. Adding to the thick layers of hate and hostility, various views sprung in random parts of the world where one group condemns and the other justifies. Who is right? Who is wrong? Who did what? Who strikes first? Views that emboldens the clashing parties to cleave more to their own prejudice. And with the 100,000 crowds across the globe shouting who they stand with and who they stand against, it can easily blind us to stick to the fight, seeing the huge crowd behind us, instead of considering the flicker of hope, the tiny communality where both parties can agree. But after seeing all these divisive positions from different places, we cannot avoid looking towards the future with a question in mind: what lies ahead? Recently, US President Trump presented his peace plan to finally resolve the Israeli-Palestine conflict.
On Sunday, I delivered to Prime Minister Netanyahu my vision for peace, prosperity, and a brighter future for the Israelis and Palestinians. This vision for peace is fundamentally different from past proposals.
The plan, dubbed to have made a paradigm shift from the previous approaches, but with the promise to keep Jerusalem as Israel's undivided capital, the Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas promptly dismissed the peace plans as a conspiracy. So, this supposed deal of the century did not settle the issue. With Trump's attempted peace plan along with other previous intermittent peace plan discussions that didn't fully end this conflict from running close to century.
Should I make it clear we do not accept America as mediator between us and Israel?
What lies ahead, we do not know. But what we do know is that today, we are now clutched in a very divisive environment where one hate tends to fuel another, creating a vicious loop that only immortalizes the conflict. With this old notion of we against them mentality, it should be easy to take sides, which state must stand and which state must fall. But beneath these conflicting interests are layers upon layers of implications, making hate and hostility a lot thicker and the point of resolution narrower. This issue is not easy. It is a lot easier to drown in the midst of clashing views, hate, and prejudices. What is the best solution? We do not know. We do not pretend to know the solution. But at least what we can do is not to add to the problem, because as the conflict drags on, the victims pile up, seeing the children and women suffering, that living and simply not dying are not the same. They only wanted to live. Probably one of the greatest hawks in history is to believe that someone is actually winning by senseless killing of innocent civilians. Sadly, this may sound like a negative view, but the solution is nowhere near, and seemingly the conflict isn't going to be resolved anytime soon. And with this age-old wound, is there a hope for healing? Only time can tell.